This is Duke University.
Good afternoon, everybody. I think we're about to begin. Thank you for coming to our conversation on race and medicine. My name is Charmaine Royal, and I'm faculty here in the Department of African and African American Studies, the Department of Biology, and the Department of Community and Family Medicine. And I'm going to be the moderator for this session, or I'm going to engage in conversation with my colleagues. Forget about the moderator part. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to start with John Hoberman. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers, read their bios, and then John will give us a 15, 20-minute introduction to the panel, setting the stage for our discussion. And then we will talk, the panelists will talk for about 30 or so minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion, all right, and for your questions. All right, so I am just thrilled to be part of this group of colleagues talking about race and medicine. The first person I'll introduce is John Hoberman. John is a medical historian who specializes in the history of medical racism and male hormone therapies. His books include Black and Blue, The Origins and Consequences of Medical Racism, and another book, Testosterone Dreams, Rejuvenation, Aphrodisia, Doping. That got a laugh. Was that you, Diane? He's also written and taught a lot on race, and he wrote a piece in the Hastings Center Report, Why Bioethics Has a Race Problem, that was published in 2016. He has taught undergraduates and medical students on race, and undergraduates he taught us a course, Race and Medicine in American Life. He's also taught medical students in the new University of Texas Dell Medical School, Racial Dimensions of Medicine. He is faculty in Germanic Studies, Professor of Germanic Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and has lectured widely on issues of race and medical racism at lots of various institutions. I saw John in the spring. I was at UT Austin giving a talk on race and genetics, and he was there, and we were talking about him potentially coming to Duke at some point in time. And then I saw that he was coming to Duke, and I thought, oh, this is great. So I reached out to Deborah, I'm like, great for bringing John. I was planning to bring him at some point in time. So we're together on that. The next panelist is Lola Fayanju. And she joined the Department of Surgery at Duke as an assistant professor in 2016. She received her undergrad degree in history and science and a Master of Arts in comparative literature from Harvard. She received her medical degree and Master's of Population Health Sciences from Washington University in St. Louis, where she also did her residency in surgery, in general surgery. Her fellowship was done in breast surgical oncology at University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. Dr. Fayanju has a strong and long-standing commitment to promoting equity and efficacy with which breast cancer patients are treated, a guiding principle that is reflected in her clinical practice and research endeavors. She's an academic breast surgeon who conducts health services research focused on addressing disparities in breast cancer outcome and treatment, as well as improving the quality and efficiency of breast cancer care delivery. Her work has been previously recognized with receipt of 2 Concord Cancer Merit Awards from the American Society of Clinical Oncology. Since coming to Duke, she's been selected as a Duke Health Fellow and has been awarded a KO2 Career Development Award to support her research. And last but not least is Damon Tweedy. He's an associate professor of psychiatry here at Duke. He graduated from Duke Medical School and subsequently from Yale Law School before returning to Duke to complete his medical and psychiatric training in 2007. He then joined the faculty in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. He's primarily based at the Durham VA Medical Center, where his responsibilities include supervising Duke psychiatry students and students in both the emergency department and in various outpatient clinics. Within the medical school, he is also a small group leader for first and second year medical students in the practice course, which introduces students to basic and advanced aspects of the doctor-patient relationship. Dr. Tweedy has published articles about race and medicine in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the Annals of Internal Medicine, and the Annals of Internal Medicine. His columns and op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, and other print publications. His recently published book, Black Man in a White Coat, A Doctor's Reflections on Race and Medicine, explores the intersection of race and medicine through the lens of his experience as a medical student, medical intern, and psychiatry resident. The book was a New York Times bestseller and was selected by Time magazine as one of the top 10 nonfiction books of 2015. Join me in just welcoming our panelists. Without saying anything else, I'm going to call on John to talk about the racial politics of medical knowledge and expertise.
Thank you very much, Charmaine. Thank you very much, Deborah, for inviting me to a conference attended by so many terrific people. I see them already. It's an honor to be on a panel with my colleagues here. And as Charmaine mentioned, my job is to take about 15 minutes to set up some big issues that the colleagues here and the colleagues in the audience can address, because they are big issues. The title, Racial Politics and Medical Expertise, could also have been the racial politics of medical knowledge. The point is that knowledge and power, as we know now, are joined together. They are intertwined. And the way medical knowledge is collected or not collected and used or not used has everything to do with the power dynamics of American medicine, and we know who runs American medicine. Black and Blue is the book that produced the research on which this material is based. Now, just a word on the sociology of knowledge. There's an official definition from Wikipedia, the study of the relationship between human thought and social context, blah, blah, blah. Mine is a little quicker than that. Who gets to know or not know what, when, why, and how? And this is the definition of the sociology of knowledge that I think applies very well to studying the racial dimension of medicine in the United States. But as Charles Mills, in his terrific book, Black Rights, White Wrongs, of this year, points out, if there's a sociology of knowledge, then there should also be a sociology of ignorance. And when I think about the way knowledge is, deployed, employed in American medicine with respect to racial issues, I think first of the sociology of ignorance rather than the sociology of knowledge. Right, that's his book. Now, what do physicians know about race in medicine? This is a very important and really neglected topic I've already discussed with a number of colleagues here today. And what I got here is a list of about a dozen propositions. I think that, reasonable medical people in most places, for the most part, would be willing to subscribe to these propositions, and I'm going to read them aloud one by one in a couple of minutes. Most doctors are generally free of racial bias and treat their patients in a racially equitable manner. 2, if doctors are not entirely free of racial bias, they're less racially biased than their fellow citizens. 3, today's doctors know about and are inclined to avoid the racial attitudes of their medical predecessors. And anybody, who reads JAMA, for example, from before the year 1950, will get a lesson in how overt medical racism could be in the pages of JAMA and the contemporary medical journals. 4, most physicians are aware of the racial disparities in medical treatments that have been widely documented in the medical literature over the past 25 years. You're looking at most of 1,000 peer-reviewed articles. 5, cardiologists and cardiac surgeons now recognize the racial disparities in care that occur within their specialty. 6, cardiologists and cardiac surgeons now agree that increasing provider awareness about disparities or improving the cultural competence of providers and institutions would likely be useful in addressing disparities. What a reasonable point of view. By now, doctors have realized that they should pay attention to their own emotions that can affect medical perceptions and judgments. And by the way, this is when I was doing the lit survey for the book, the whole idea that doctors would really benefit from examining their own emotions and complexes and all that for the benefit of providing better care dates from the 1980s, not the 1880s, the 1980s. Given the introspective requirements of psychiatric training, the field of psychiatry is less vulnerable to infiltration by racial folklore than the other medical subdisciplines. Transplant surgeons make a point of being well acquainted with the therapeutic preferences of their black patients. Well, they darn well should, given that the consequences might be life and death. Informal transmission of racial stereotypes and racist banter have been largely eliminated from hospitals and clinics. Medical publications about inadequate pain relief for black adults and children in hospitals have finally produced effective reform. Actually, I mean, this is a story that made it onto the front page of the New York Times in August of last year. Black physicians enjoy the same working conditions and professional rewards as their white colleagues. And then finally, American medical schools are now collecting data for the purpose of understanding and ameliorating racial health disparities. Well, in fact, not one of these statements is true. These false premises are the basis of the second kind of big idea that I want to fit in here, the medical liberal doctrine that prevails in American medicine. This is a mindset that accepts the current state of race relations in medicine while acknowledging the need for certain improvements, such as cultural competency training, further research on the troubling racial health disparities. Troubling is the medical liberal's favorite adjective for broadcasting the fact that he has a working conscience. Placing medical students in underserved communities. UT Dell is doing that, but darned if I can convince the dean to do what I want him to do. Eliminating racial identifiers in case presentations, which they're doing at UT Dell as well. All right, what is medical liberalism? I mean, look at the situation. We have, since the late 80s, as I said, something like 1,000 peer-reviewed articles that show that the euphemism is underserved, that black patients in just about every medical discipline you can name are being cheated of the equitable care that they deserve as our fellow citizens and human beings. It's the coping, okay, so that's the reality. So then the question becomes, how does the medical establishment run by white people, how do they live with themselves when their own refereed literature is publishing this evidence by the hundreds and hundreds of reports? They have to find a way to cope. And so what is medical liberalism? It's the coping strategy organized medicine has developed since the late 80s to cope with the existence of massive racial health disparities between blacks and whites and the hundreds of reports in the medical literature concerning the dangerous and potentially fatal undertreatment of black patients suffering from serious medical conditions. Medical liberalism is a set of gestures, sentiments, expressions of concern, euphemisms, delaying tactics, and half measures that aim at eliminating, aim at eliminating bias, while acknowledging that black patients are not treated as well as white patients in American hospitals and clinics. And of course, the key question is, how seriously are the deciders at the top of American medical institutions and medical schools, where one would think that ethics might gain a stronger grip on policy? What are they going to do about it? All right, here's, I met an African-American Ivy League medical student at a meeting in Houston in March. In May, he sent me the following comment. Whether through the lens of medical research, the study of racial bias in medical education, or our humanities series via guest poets, we've had multiple events covering issues of racism in academia and in medicine. The coping strategy of medical liberalism and the desire for administrators to delay is exactly what we are trying to defend against, we, the progressive students at Yale, and there is some organization there. I mean, there is a psychiatric medical student organization at Yale, for example, by pushing the conversation forward at this medical school. So, I mean, there is a view from somebody who is on the spot. And he is the reason that I'll be talking at Yale on October the 10th. Medical liberal, the patient called me colored girl, the senior doctor training me said nothing. Medical liberalism is allowing, is not fighting back against racist banter, or whatever you want to call it, in real life. The racially abusive patient is a fact. Gets interesting because patients have real rights about choosing their doctors. That can get very, very sticky. But this is a failure of medical liberalism, and it is a long list of failures. The pain gap, why doctors offer less relief to black. This is now notorious. The Kelly Hoffman paper that appeared in the PNAS in 2016 was widely publicized. To the best of my knowledge, organized medicine has done nothing to orchestrate any sort of response to 25 years of papers about the under-medication of African-American pain. Knox Todd was publishing about this in the early 90s. I could show you a list of 20 papers. And so the medical liberal approach to facing these issues is endless publications, next to no action. The medical liberal system is based on a racial politics of medical expertise or knowledge. This racial politics includes an historically naive view of the nature and prevalence of modern racism, as well as the racially motivated diagnoses and treatments that persist in modern medicine. Now, in order to make this point in a very efficient way, in a rush, all I have to do is say the word Trump. We have all seen what the ascension of Trump has taught us about that reservoir of anti-black racism that has been out there and under-attended to, except by very few people. The kinds of manifestations that, well, I don't have to describe them to you. But here's the thing. Here is the excellent Newsweek, October 21st, 1963. There's a remarkable article. I'll send it to anybody who wants it. White stereotypes of the Negro, they laugh a lot, less ambition, they smell different, et cetera, et cetera. This is 2 months after Dr. King's March on Washington. And so you don't have so much data about, how whites think about black people. Well, the Trump era has taught us stuff we didn't know before. Here, there is a very important point that Kelly Hoffman and her co-authors make in the famous PNS paper about racially differential pain relief. Many white medical students and residents hold beliefs about biological differences between blacks and whites, many of which are false and fantastical in nature, including, there is published literature on a lot of whites' views that black people have superhuman powers, for example. It is fantasy land out there. And these false beliefs are related to racial bias and pain perception. So in other words, if you have racial primitivism in the white population that is going to feed people into medical school, then don't underestimate the volume and influence of that medical and nature of that medical primitivism if you want your doctors to be racially competent people. Okay, and so here's a big point I wanted to offer. Medical liberalism and the dissenting, this coping strategy of the people in power. And the dissenting black perspectives that challenge it are parallel universes that coexist within the racial dimension of American medicine. The racial imbalance of power within medicine makes this contest between competing perspectives an unequal contest. That is why JAMA has an impact factor of 35, and the African American edited Journal of the National Medical Association has an impact factor of 1. Well, I know the current editor of the JNMA, and he told me the other day, it isn't 1 anymore. It's about 1.3. No doubt due to his skillful editing. But medical, this, and the New England Journal, by the way, is 60. That's impact factor-wise. This is racial segregation. And as a matter of fact, the more you look at this material, the more dimensions, segregated dimensions, fault lines, axes within American medicine that are racially segregated. The vast majority of white physicians don't pay attention because they don't have to. In other words, the racial imbalance of power that forces African Americans to be students of race relations in a far more intense and continuous way than the great majority of whites operates within the medical sphere as well. Medical journal editors are gatekeepers who can promote or suppress race-related medical expertise or knowledge. In this sense, JAMA and the JNMA portray 2 different versions of medical reality. And you know what? The great majority of American doctors don't even know that the JNMA exists. So have I ever seen the JNMA cited in the New York Times? Almost never in the so-called mainstream medical literature with the white editors. Right, I want to conclude, medical liberalism has rhetorical techniques. Because in a certain sense, what I'm saying is the medical establishment copes with hundreds of publications demonstrating its own failure to serve African American patients in anything like an equitable manner by learning how to talk to itself. It has a narrative that it repeats to itself, and like any narrative, it employs rhetorical techniques. So there's euphemism, the calculated evasion of knowledge, the use of the hypothetical and the subjunctive. Some previous studies have suggested that blacks have lower use of surgery, and then the whole question as to why patient preference for white and black patients might have different dynamics, different historical contexts. That is a subject unto itself. 3, alternative explanations for racially differential treatment. Anything but confronting the reality, the documented reality in the literature of biased practices within important medical specialties. Defensive arguments and denial. Wenneker and Epstein, 1989, it would be unwise to conclude from this study that black patients are underserved or directly harmed by undergoing fewer procedures. And by the way, one of the alibis is, well, you know what? The white patients are getting too many procedures. So if the blacks are getting fewer procedures, just right, like Goldilocks. Okay? I mean, the lengths these authors will go to in order to protect themselves from the realities of their own behavior, the consequences of their own behavior is just ingenious. And the complexity alibi, it's all too complex to understand. Why is there racially differential diagnosis and treatment? It's just all so complex. Okay, and so I made it. Wow. The medical liberalism, the basics, I'm claiming that this is, in fact, the regnant system within American medicine. This is the doctrine of the deciders. And if you want to sum it up, what do you got? You got ambivalence about reform, the troubled mindset that shows that it has at least some ethical feeling but isn't going to do anything, the use of euphemisms to evade racial realities, ignorance of the history of medical racism, endless publications, no action. naivete about the prevalence of biological racism, refusal to accept responsibility for physician behaviors, a preference for the non-racial explanations of what goes wrong, unwarranted confidence in good intentions, an old quote-unquote liberal trait, taking unwarranted comfort in unconscious bias. Well, if he's biased, you can't blame him. I mean, it's unconscious. You know, my response being, after how many years of listening to this, does the profession have some sort of obligation to say unconscious bias has real effects? It doesn't matter whether it's unconscious. The emphasis is on cleaning up the record of the white physician, but the emphasis should be on the consequences for patients of quote-unquote unconscious bias, which can be deadly, emphasizing complexity to avoid accountability, etc. So we actually kind of made it to the end. These are, I think, big issues that we all need to think about and do something about on behalf of producing racially competent and ethical physicians. So thank you for your attention.
I'm going to start by playing devil's advocate a little bit. So your presentation, John, focused on the black-white dichotomy, and we have two physicians here, and I wanted to hear from Lola and Damon about this dichotomy and whether medicine is really so black and white. And what about other groups? Are they treated the same way? Are they treated in different ways? Does this notion of race translate the same way with other populations? Or is there really a distinct difference between how black patients are treated by white physicians, which is pretty much what John talked about? What about physicians from other groups? What about black physicians and how they practice medicine? Or is this a more systemic problem in medicine about how we think about difference and the role of biology in our perspectives about difference?
Well, I guess I would say that the black-white dichotomy is sort of the oldest dichotomy, and it's the oldest distinction. In some ways, it will always sort of be the kind of representation of it, right? In some ways, so but all that being said, so in some ways, that's always the most acute and the most it can evoke the most emotional content, because in large extent, historically, if you go back and read some of the articles that he's talking about, it really is a very much a black-white discussion. Now, of course, our country has evolved quite a bit in many ways, and it's much more diverse. So what I would say then is, as far as other racial groups, however you want to use that term, you will see some of the same things manifest sometimes in different ways, but you certainly will see some of those things. And also even the idea of what are doctors like. So I mean, one of the problems is that all of us doctors are still trained under that same initial system, and so you will still then you might see doctors who are not white still manifesting some of these same patterns of behavior, because the system itself has been promulgated down from the beginning when it was an all-white system. So I think it's not as simple as black and white, although that historically has set the terms for the conversation.
Yeah, and you touched on the system, and we're going to talk about the system in a while. And we're going to fix the system before we leave here. All right, Lola.
What I would say is I think it's going to be very dependent on which part of the country you're in, and obviously which country you're in, which racial dynamic is going to be at the forefront. So one of my very good friends is a surgeon in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and so she is dealing much more with some of the cultural divisions between the Native American population and a primarily white group of providers, but also between Latino patients and providers and white patients and providers, and of course people who inhabit both identities or multiple identities, and how they're viewed by the providers that they see. I think that what is challenging as America becomes a more diverse country is that we need to really move away from the monolithism ascribed to different racial groups. I think to assume that a physician who was born and raised in Nigeria, where my family is from, knows how to interact with Black American patients from Tennessee is a very dangerous assumption, and one that I have seen as someone who straddles a couple of different worlds with regards to how I identify. I think that as Damon was just saying, one of the challenges is that even those of us who are physicians of color are trained in a system in which these biases are implicitly inherited and passed down maybe less implicitly. We know what the words non-compliant mean in a chart. We know what the words that, I found, for instance, a record of my own visit to a doctor in college that commented on the fact that I was late, and I was not late. Again, ascribing a sense of, colored people's time or whatever has been used to try and negate my claims during that visit. And so what we can do to realize that even those of us who are not only well-intentioned but come from backgrounds that are absolutely affected by this are still going to bring some of these prejudices and biases to the table, I think allows us to say, look, there is no way you can't bring prejudice because I bring prejudice. And so acknowledging that and not just glossing over it, but actually being willing to do something about it, realizing we all suffer from the same issues is a huge, important thing for us to do.
John, I'll let you speak to that as well.
Well, I think your point is very well taken, and I'll just tell you autobiographically, the racial issue of my youth that had, retrospectively, certain kinds of emotional traumatic effects on me, even if I was a privileged kid by comparison with most. That is the focus that I have grown up with. And one thing I do not take into my classroom is a very adequate knowledge in Texas of the Hispanic experience in medicine. As a matter of fact, I've had students say in the race and med class, may I write a paper about the notion of respeto in the medical context of South Texas, et cetera, or may I say, of course, because it's the same methodology, typologically, they're the same sorts of relationships. There's a power differential. There is a long history of nasty prejudice against Mexicans and Mexican Americans in Texas, so that there's a homology there. The other thing is, the point about paying, our colleagues' point about paying attention to the various origins of various people whose cultural formations in the medical world have been different. I'm thinking of a book I read years ago. I think it's 2004. It's a book on medical racism, but you know what it is? This is a doctor in Britain of South Asian origin who is writing about the mistreatment of these people at the hands of the white British medical establishment. So, there's obviously a relativism to it. And, one or both of my fellow panelists made the point that, forget the idea that minority medical students are going to be immune to the medical racial folklore that floats in thick clouds around some medical schools. Of course, they're vulnerable, and of course, the peer pressure thing is just going to reinforce that. So I agree with everybody. The whole thing has to be nuanced in that way.
And as we think about how medical students and medical doctors come to these perspectives, we have to place it in a broader context. In a survey that my research team just completed, a national survey of the U.S. population on perspectives on race, and looking at how the U.S. population thinks about biological constructions of race versus social constructions of race. We found that 55%, and this is a national representative sample of the U.S., about 1,700 people, about 55% of the U.S. population believes that we do have biological races, that these groups that we've constructed and called races are actually biological. 70% of the people who had that perspective were white. 58% of them were Asian or Asian Pacific Islanders. 55% of Native Americans feel this way or felt this way in our survey. 48% of Hispanics and 46% of Blacks. So these perspectives are pervasive about the differences that we see and what those differences actually mean. And they've made their way into society, they've made their way into medicine, they've made their way into every aspect of our lives. And the medical establishment is, I think, where we critique it probably the most, because of the implications for health and the links to biology. And it's so easy to link it to medicine because of our perspectives about biology and science and what that actually means and what that tells us about variation that we see. How do we address these? Okay, go ahead, Lola.
Let me see if I remember my thought now. What I was going to say is part of the problem is that it's only in kind of conferences at highfalutin places like Duke where we talk about the clinal versus categorical notion of race, in courses about postmodernism and courses about, relativism and courses about the extent to which, migration and intermarriage changes our racial makeup and contributes to the diseases to which we're susceptible. These conversations aren't happening with our patients. They're not happening even that much in the, quotes, mainstream media, realizing that the New York Times is not the mainstream media for most of our patients. So, and how can you blame patients for thinking there's a biological basis for race when they request their own medical records and the first thing it says is this is a 45-year-old African-American woman? What's been interesting from my experience is that my husband is a white man from England with some Indian ancestry. And it's interesting that when we've taken our children for pediatric appointments, what race they are assigned depends on which parent brings them to the appointment. And that says a lot, right? That we've never completed that, and yet someone decides based on what they guess must be going on, what the race of that child is. And so, again, I think that part of it is our language in terms of how we headline race in our medical records, in our medical communications, in ways that patients actually see. And the way they actually see it is probably their own medical records, and in how patients talk about them and to them in ways that they're actually able to witness.
That's a good point, because I think where I was going was to try to figure out how do we connect what's going on in medicine with what's going on in society. And do patients actually, is it the medical records and how we write the medical records that make patients actually have these perspectives? And where did the perspectives come from in the first place for the people who are physicians? So I guess my thinking is there a more fundamental level at which we need to address this, as opposed to thinking it needs to begin with the doctors, right? Because medicine, again, is practiced in a society or in societies, and it's practiced different ways in different societies. And I'm trying to see how we link medicine with society, or the practice of medicine with what goes on in a society, and what are the ways of doing that.
So just a quick question. So in the survey, when he says biological, I mean, was that just written just as is? Was it written just as you posed it, or was there some qualification as to what that meant when you said biological?
Well, we said biological, and then we asked also about social, or how people think about biological. So yes, we had some qualifications to it.
And did that yield any interesting when you sort of?
No, pretty much the same way. I mean, well, many people, when they think biological, they think skin color or physical features, even when we asked further about what they meant by that. Right. Not many people actually said the word genetics. Some did, or so it's complicated.
Your comment about, what does this all mean, instantly brings up for me is the utter failure of this society to educate people about quote unquote race, and to address the multidimensionality of it, to put the old myths to rest, that into this vacuum streams all sorts of nonsense and makes certain political candidacies viable, which would not be viable in a more racially civilized polity.
Well, I think the extent to which you just said, but the extent to which you just said that, that vacuum enables the reification of ignorance, right? It allows it to take form and to harden and to be very difficult to eradicate. I think that's exactly right. And we have to question what's happening in our schools. But God knows education now is happening outside of our schools on the internet. One of the things I have to do with my patients when they come and see me is correct whatever they think they've learned on the internet with regards to breast cancer. And I have to specify these are websites I trust because I know that they will have found many things that Google has unfortunately led them to. And that is a very difficult thing. And if they're doing it about breast cancer, which frankly our society has much more investment in than it does in race relations and medicine, then God knows they're going to find misinformation about race.
Yeah. And Lola, as you talk about your patients in breast cancer, your breast cancer patients, the field of surgery is one of those that I think has not been implicated in these conversations about race as much as cardiology. I mean, cardiology is notorious, and if I'm a cardiologist in here, I'm sorry, but cardiology is one that, we think about hypertension, we think about heart failure. Among medical specialties, I think cardiology is one of the most that's often implicated in issues related to race and not surgery as such. I have a colleague in California who's a cardiothoracic surgeon, and she is interested in issues of race, and she talks about the fact that surgeons don't talk about race. She talked about the fact that even the journals, she has never seen a paper on race and racism in surgery, but yes, she sees it so much in terms of what procedures are recommended and how those procedures are done. Talk a little bit about surgery and race and racism in surgery.
Yeah, surgery is a pretty interesting space to occupy as a Black woman in America. I'm actually the first Black woman surgeon on faculty at Duke ever. Yeah, that's kind of, you shouldn't applaud. That's horrible, actually. What I would say is I am too young, and I'd like to think of myself as young, to still be doing firsts, right? This is ridiculous. I was the second Black woman general surgery resident ever at Washington University in St. Louis. Again, I should not be the first of anything anymore. People talk about the intersectionality of identity. You have to think about the intersectionality of prejudice, too. So my experience as a Black woman surgeon has been very different from that of my male Black surgery colleagues and even my male brothers, two of whom are doctors. It's interesting how the way in which stereotypes about both my race and my gender and my ethnicity as a foreign-sounding woman with name of a woman influence how people view me, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. I think that what my female colleagues and I found was that sometimes your attendings kind of threw you softballs, so they were afraid you were going to cry. Or they wouldn't give you the criticism you probably needed to be a better surgeon because, again, they were afraid you were going to cry. But at the same time, one of my favorite attendings told me that you want your surgeon to have the eyes of an eagle, the heart of a lion, and the hands of a woman, because we were more likely to take instruction and be a bit more gentle with the tissue. So that's kind of what I take to heart. But with regards to surgery and talking about race and engaging with race, I think one of the challenges is that there is a self-selection about who goes into different disciplines. If you look at the political affiliations of providers and everything from the liberal powerhouses of infectious disease, pediatrics, and psychiatry, all the way up to all of us proceduralists and surgery, interventional radiology, gastroenterologists, you will see, a shift towards ever redder colors. Maybe related to blood, I'm not sure, but really reflected in our political affiliations. And so the issue is that within medicine, as my colleague just eloquently described, there's a lot of power in publication. And the way you ascend is by publishing in journals that your colleagues will also read. So the issue is that if you have colleagues who only read the Annals of Surgery, or JAMA, and the Annals of Surgery rarely publishes on race, but yet you need to ascend to the point where anyone wants to listen to you at all, you need to somehow strike a balance between being published in these high-impact journals while also publishing on something that, frankly, many of them don't care about. And that's the tension that exists for those of us who are interested in racial disparities within surgical care. I think we are making progress. I think there is increasing information on disparities in surgical care. And I think in part the way we're getting to that is that many surgical diseases require multidisciplinary care. So as an oncologist, I work with medical oncologists who care a bit more about race. And that kind of allows us to share the stage in oncology and bring to the forefront our experiences as the surgeons who cut out the cancer. But there's still a long ways to go. My personal area of research and interest is in mitigating disparities in healthcare, but actually looking at modifiable risk factors, because I feel like so much of our time is spent cataloging all the ways in which breast cancer has worse outcomes and is diagnosed at worst stage in Black women. But gosh, we've been cataloging for a long time now, and we need to get on with making some change. And part of the way you make that change, frankly, is engaging your colleagues on things they do care about, which is cost. And so one of the things that I'm actually looking into is value-based healthcare, looking at the intersection between quality of care and cost of care and how that affects outcomes, because that might engage my colleagues who frankly don't care about as much about race, but do care much more about the increased recurrence in people of color or people in minority groups that then translates into higher costs for all of us.
Great, thank you, Lola. Damon?
I was just going to say, just to echo her points, I was recently at a conference speaking to a group of anesthesiologists who, in many ways, many of them are probably were aspiring surgeons. Or
well, yeah, they're a little bitter.
So,
That's okay.
there's some of that same sort of sentiments. And I remember the discussion, again, very much not inclined to talk about these issues at all. And the only way and so it was actually, the only reason I came to this conference is because the woman who was the person in charge of the organization was actually an African American woman, and she was another first. At first, and again, this is really sad, 2017, but another first. And so she was sort of took upon herself to sort of bring this to the table. And the only way in which the doctors were able to sort of engage in discussion was, again, about making it about costs in some sort of practical way. They really weren't as interested in the racial dynamics. So I'm just really echoing your comments as well, very much so.
All right, great. John?
I have an anecdote about race and surgery that is instructive regarding the racial politics of medical knowledge. It's 2004. A very well-published Harvard cardiologist with a serious interest in race and medicine publishes a paper. And the finding of the paper is that the more confident the kidney transplant surgeon is regarding the wishes of the Black patient, the wronger he is. And this result was achieved by actually interviewing Black patients as well as white surgeons, which has not been the rule, I think, for a long time. Now, this finding seems to me one that would be properly broadcast to the profession. It was buried in the archives of kidney research. And so my question, maybe there is a response to this that I don't understand. My question is, why was this particular finding, which undermines the authority of the surgeon, buried in a journal that very few people are going to read? Who made the choice that this was not worthy of being exposed to a medical audience? And on this particular topic, I can speak personally. When my book, Black and Blue, was sent to the American Journal of Psychiatry, biggest psychiatric journal in the world, the editors, who I'm guessing are white, sent the book to two African American psychiatrists, senior people, and said to them basically, is this thing even worth reviewing? And their response was, yes, it is worth reviewing. Not because I wrote it, but because the topic is the origins and consequences of medical racism. In other words, African American psychiatrists had to instruct the editors of a very important journal that, guess what? Medical racism is a topic that is worth covering.
But thank God they sent it to Black people who actually wanted to hear about this, right? That they didn't send it to Ben Carson or Omarosa, right? I mean, the problem is that you can't be sure that just because someone looks a certain way, they're truly an ally to the causes that you espouse. And that's the danger, again, of this exceptionalism that occurs within medicine. When there are so few people there, you cannot assume that they're all representative of the true kind of challenges and beliefs of the larger population. And so I'm glad they sent this to the right people. But what you point out about the journal is exactly right. And I will tell you, I think a lot of it is about getting people who care about these issues and who are either physicians of color or who are allies of physicians of color into positions where they can impact editorial decisions as to what even gets out for peer review. There's a lot of desk rejects these days. And the tragedy, and I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, is that we benefit in this regard from the fact that most peer review in medicine is not double-blinded. People know who's writing it. Now, my husband, as a political scientist, is horrified by this. At the same time, it is somewhat empowering because if you see the name of someone you know, you are more likely to give it a second read. And if that person you know is us, you might be more likely to get it to publication in somewhere that people are going to read it. So
that only works though if you're inside the system, though, right? If you have people on the inside.
right,
Otherwise,
you
it
know
would be
that.
the opposite.
exactly,
right.
exactly.
Well, at this point, I'm going to open it up because this conversation really dovetails on parts of our conversation this morning about publications and what gets published. And Lundy talked about some of her work, and I think Neil also talked about what gets published and who publishes what. So we'll just open it up now, and then we'll continue the conversation. So open it up for questions. So Dennis, Thomas, we have the mic here.
Fortunately, there are a lot of Black women who want to do surgery as medical students at Duke, including neurosurgery, et cetera. I work with them. And so you may be the first, but you won't be the last.
I hope not. I meet with them regularly, so
Yeah,
I'm trying.
I mean, I'm so excited. And they've been to Uganda, and we worked with neurosurgeons. I mean, I'm really excited. So that's good news. The question I have is, how do you motivate the vast majority of people that probably have this implicit bias to do something because it doesn't really affect them? I mean, that's the big question. I mean, until you have enough people that it matters to, probably there's not going to be a change. So how do you make it matter to them?
Well, for the last year or so, I have had the privilege of hanging out at a medical school and learning a great deal gradually. I have an infinite amount to learn, but at least I go to events and soak up the knowledge that doctors have. And I know it wasn't that long ago I heard one of these people who knows much more about medical schools and medical students than I do say it's basically hopeless. We're going to have to start with this generation. Because one question that I asked of her is, which I think is a very sort of unpleasant and depressing question, and I just sort of put it like this rhetorically. I said, in terms of producing racially competent physicians who even care about racially differential diagnosis and treatment that disadvantages patients, I think what I said to her was, what are you going to do with that 53-year-old medical expert ego who is not going to be taking instruction on the way he ought to sophisticate his views of race and racial equity? My guess is that's a really, really tough one. Now I'm going to pull a kind of an answer out of a hat, though I'm not an expert on it. And here's my question. I have put it to doctors. I've put it to lawyers. When is medical racism going to be defined as medical malpractice? And bring in the lawyers.
Okay. So I will. Oh, go ahead, Damon. No, you go.
No, I was just going to echo. I think it will be much more difficult to someone who's entrenched in their practice patterns to change. I do think that, I don't know what your experience has been like. I do find that students are at baseline more interested and engaged in these issues than they were when I was a student. So I remember being a medical student, and these kind of conversations really weren't even here at the same institution 20 years ago, not even on the table. There would be very much almost lip service paid. The students themselves weren't even. Many students I would hear would say that would see it as a waste of time. Like, we should be learning about whatever maybe, whatever was more important, the latest, study, whatever journal. So I think there's a generational aspect too, which I hope will be part of that solution moving forward. People are trying to make like an economic argument for it, trying to make it much more a language that everyone can speak, right? And so that's also another way in which you see people trying to engage in this issue. But I never actually thought about it in those terms. The idea of it being bringing the lawyers on board.
Surgeons don't respond well to hearing about lawyers. That being said, God knows our residency is built on a stick versus carrot, much more of a stick versus carrot approach. There are a number of quips about surgeons, but one of them is that, a beating is a hug that hurts. I know, it's horrifying. But basically, there's a lot of very heavy-handed instruction in surgery. Yes. That aside, I think your point about the Newsweek article from 1963 demonstrating that the white people who knew black people were less likely to have these prejudiced views, or at least to acknowledge them, is powerful, because what I found, and I'm sure you've had this experience too, is that when you are one of the few, you become this seat of racial authority for many people. And I trained in St. Louis right after Ferguson. And so I had many an operating room conversation. I'm doing a thyroidectomy, and a longtime mentor and friend who reads the New York Post, and I'm pretty sure voted for Trump, is asking me, so Lola, what do you think about Ferguson? And here we are, he's in a position of authority over me, but I think someone who does respect me, and I respect him. And it is obviously an exhausting position to occupy, constantly being the source of knowledge, purported source of knowledge for these things. At the same time, it was pretty amazing watching this person who I consider a friend, his perspectives on race as well as sexual orientation change, dare I say evolve, over the course of our friendship and mentorship, and that it comes in part from meeting someone and knowing someone who you can actually relate to, who was in Lowell House at Harvard like you were, that can finally convince you that this is not just some theoretical us-them, like this is a we. But it can't happen until you meet those people, and those people aren't making their way into surgery. How are you going to meet them? So it's tough.
I think going back to something Damon said about the current generation and even the next generation, because the children of today will grow up to be the doctors of tomorrow, and I think the way we stem this pervasive race-based, and not just race-based, but the negative connotations that are attached with this idea of race, is to start with the kids. Of course, there are some doctors who will change based on new knowledge about difference. That I taught a course last year to the medical students, the first year medical students, race and medicine, and that course dealt with how we think about race, the biological construction of race and ancestry, and what it all means, and bringing it all the way to the social construction and how we think about race in medicine. And many students in that class of 100 and something, some of them had never heard that before. They didn't really know the evidence, or why is it that we say there are not these natural, distinct differences between the groups that we see, which is at the heart of how medicine is practiced. The paper by Hoffman that was published on pain, and they asked the medical students, and they had community people in that as well. It wasn't just medical students, about their thoughts about biological difference. And it is because we think of those differences that we practice medicine in certain ways, because we have these ideas about homogeneity of certain groups and the difference between those groups, those monolithic groups, and these other groups that themselves are monolithic, and we don't think about the overlap of qualities in the groups. And I think until we dispel those notions of difference and what it means in terms of health, then medicine will always be practiced the way it is. I mean, some of the students who took the class, they came back and they would tell me that they've been challenging their attendings and residents on some of the things that they've been hearing, but they won't budge. Well, they can't, because they're saying medicine is just practiced in this particular way. The boards ask questions in a particular way, and so there's so many levels at which we need to address this. It can't just start at with the medical establishment, because I have to go back to the medical establishment in any country is based in a society that has particular views, and what society tells us is what all of us subscribe to. As I said, we see these perspectives, whether you're black, white. I mean, we saw it higher in the group that considers themselves white, but people across America have these perceptions of difference. And so I think there has to be a fundamental approach to how we dispel these notions, because those make them their way right into medicine.
If you can't persuade them that it's the right thing to do to engage with their own bias, convince them that not doing so will make them a worse doctor, like literally in a Press Ganey associated worse doctor. But also with regards to not getting the right diagnosis sometimes. Probably every year or two, there'd be a child, an African-American child, who would present to St. Louis Children's Hospital with difficulty breathing, recurrent pulmonary infections, et cetera, and it would take weeks to diagnose cystic fibrosis, because people forgot that cystic fibrosis can happen in anyone, and that the racial background, that the background of Black Americans is complex and includes many lineages. So again, you don't think that way, you're not a good doctor, because you forgot that in a differential diagnosis.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you all about how to engage communities around these questions of social and familial differences. Harkening back to a question that you asked earlier about how the word biological was understood in the survey. How do people coming from the kind of highfalutin academic environments translate the difference between, just biological reproductive context in our lives and the kinds of issues of the biological that you're addressing in your work? How do we create programming that will really welcome in the community so that patients can become important agents in pressing for change?
Center for Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, funded by the Kellogg Foundation. And the Kellogg Foundation started this initiative based on these same ideas and discussions about how we get the broader society to change. and obviously, and hopefully with it starting from the communities, then it will make its way up. And so they started this initiative last year, Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, to dispel this notion of racial hierarchies. And that's the goal. They started working with community organizations, and then this year they put some funding into academic institutions that will work with their communities to do that. And Duke is one of the 10, Brown is one, I don't know if Lundy is involved in that, and 10 institutions across the country. And for our center, we're going to be working with various community organizations in Durham, first to see what the narratives are about race. And then use the data from those studies to construct new narratives and to have conversations on campus and in Durham about that. And I think those are the kinds of ways having universities work along with the communities within which they exist, to take that information from the quote unquote ivory towers to people in the community, because they're our patients, and they're the people that we will be interacting with each day. So I think those kinds of partnerships and making those partnerships equitable, not us going down to them, but partnering and having conversations and us doing this work together.
So some years ago, Muzarim Banaji gave a keynote address at the American Association of Medical Colleges about her book Blind Spot, and following on that, there was quite a movement among quite a few medical schools to make clinicians and at least academic medical educators aware of unconscious bias to various instruments. But I'm not sure what kind of impact that has had, or what your view would be if that still falls into the unwarranted comfort in unconscious bias. So if that is the first step, making people aware like that.
I think you got it exactly right, that that it has to be the first step. Interestingly, one of the innovations at UT Dell is the universal application of the IAT, the implicit association test. And I don't think the person who, the dean who has encouraged that, and he's a mover and a shaker in terms of progressive medical education there. I think he's sort of the champion in that department. He knows perfectly well that this is only a first step, and the question is, what sort of an attitude are you going to take, and what sort of actions are you going to take as a conscientious professional once you learn that, like the great majority of, bless you, the great majority of people, you have some sort of implicit bias that this clever technique, which has a pretty good press in terms of its validity. I mean, it can't be perfect, but it's gained quite a bit of acceptance. The question is, what do you do with it? I mean, it's like my question about what do you do with 600 or 700 or 800 articles documenting that the terrible things are happening in terms of medical inequities in a whole variety of medical specialties. You know, I think in terms of the, just visiting the explosive legal issue once again, I'm thinking of a paper that was published in 2002 by Peter Bach, who is a cancer expert at Sloan Kettering. And when you look at the prose he's using, and my PhD is in literature. Maybe that's why I pay so much attention to language. But when I read the medical literature, I read it very carefully. I read it for rhetoric. I read it for euphemisms, et cetera, et cetera. He actually refers to excess deaths among the black patient cohort. And unless I am mistaken, what he is saying, but he is not saying it loudly, and he's not saying it demonstratively, is that had these people had a fair shot at therapy, there's 7 men who would be alive who are now dead. And one of my points about the medical literature is that this kind of material is hiding in there. It's hiding in there because of the prose it is couched in. It's hiding in there because experienced medical professionals choose not to raise a flag and say, can we really live with these data as conscientious professionals? Or the one about the overconfident surgeons, that shouldn't there be some sort of publicity or publicizing mechanism in American medicine? Call it, ethnic news bulletins or something like that, that it is now known that an entire class of medical professionals is prone to be sloppy or not care or just plain mistaken about whether in this case, a black patient wants to go through with a transplant surgery. And that, as I'm sure many of you know, is very complicated because there are ideas floating around in the medical literature about the degree to which black patients are willing to accept high technology procedures, okay? The whole patient preferences thing has been a smokescreen and an alibi for medical authors for a long time, because they would say, well, it's true that a disproportionately small number of black patients were given this procedure or experienced this beneficial procedure. And at this point, you say, well, why is that? And there are medical authors who would say, well, that was the patient's preference. Patient preference, it turns out to be a standard term in the medical literature. I think it is slowly being better understood because the patient who makes the preference about something as momentous, say, as a kidney transplant, in the case of the African American patient, the odds that this person is going to have in his or her family history traumatic family stories about how they were treated by doctors back to the grandfather and the great-grandfather, et cetera, et cetera. It's not that there aren't white families who don't have horror stories about doctors. But in terms of probabilities, it is more likely that the black patient, when making that preference for either getting or not getting the procedure, may be dealing with some memory trauma at the same time that choice is being made. So these are the kinds of factors that have to be integrated into conscientious decision, in this case by surgeons, but there's all sorts of conscientious decisions that a whole variety of doctors are obligated to make. So again, I mean, taking your point about the next step. American medicine, I mean, individual doctors have important decisions to make. I'll tell you a story, a true story. It's November of 1999, and a bioethicist friend of mine has gotten me invited to a meeting at the New York Academy of Medicine near Central Park. And the reason I was invited, this is in the very early years of my interest in this subject, and the bioethicist knew that I'd get something out of going to this meeting. And so the vice president of the New York Academy of Medicine stands up in front of 50 or 60 New York doctors who are aligned in, folding chairs, and says, this is 1999, because you can if you spend a lot of time in the library, like some people like me, you can track the timeline of when American medicine should have woken up. Well, this man was pretty honest by medical standards of the time, and he said, look, the data are in, it's unambiguous. The black population is getting inferior care. And I remember his words. He says, it's up to us to decide whether we're going to own it. Okay, that's what he said. There wasn't a peep out of those 50 or 60 prosperous New York doctors sitting there on those chairs. They couldn't have cared less. And that's a problem.
Thank you, John. Any more questions? Is there a question here?
This is great. I'm loving this. I think it's super interesting. But I also want to question this idea of perpetual progress, and that things are always getting better. I think that's a narrative as a country that we tell ourselves, and I think we forget sometimes what a young country we are. And I guess I don't actually have a question, but I'd be curious to see what you think about my opinion.
I completely agree. I think that never-ending progress is a part of American mythology. It makes everyone feel better about ourselves, even when there's real evidence that there has been regression on a number of points. One of my husband's area of interest is post-factual America. And I think the extent to which we have regressed from embracing the scientific method and its results is a really telling thing. Now, part of me wonders if what's happened is that education, frankly, used to be very good for a certain segment of the population and has been very bad for another segment of the population for a long time. And now they're actually merging towards each other rather than getting better for everyone, such that there's just kind of, again, less science taught across all types of schools, across all types of children, leading to this, frankly, worship of ignorance and the idea that your opinion is as good as my facts.
Amen.
No, yeah, I mean, I certainly think that anytime that there is progress, there is always going to be resistance and backlash, or certainly no sort of, it's not always going to be going in a certain direction. I would certainly agree with you. That's what your point was. Yeah, and I also echo her points as well. You're very eloquent. Can't say it any better. Yeah.
Well, let me ask both of you, Lola and Damon, as we think about progress, and let's take it back to medicine, and try to see what is it, or how can, I've talked about starting at even before that, but let's look at the field of medicine as a whole, and what can we do to to facilitate progress in terms of how medicine is practiced. Because many of the students I'm hearing is, we're saying these things, but it's not going to change because this is how medicine is done. And Damon, you talked about how medicine has changed, or it used to be practiced in terms of the black-white dichotomy. But have there been enough or substantial change in that arena, and what do we need to take it to another level, you think? I know those are big questions to ask me to solve the whole problem, but just thinking through what are some of the practical things you think? There's the sticks and carrots, which we do, the boards and the accreditations of the programs and these kinds of things. But
I think that, again, representation is key. Representation in positions of power is key. I really think it just makes a huge difference when the leadership in medicine looks like the population we serve across different disciplines. I think that, frankly, again, pediatrics, OB-GYN, are fields where there has been more of that, and I suspect that that's impacted the quality of care. I think sadly surgery is not an area, and because there are many different kinds of surgery where you'll see that as much. I think mentorship on the part of physicians who've managed to break through into that world is obviously tough, but it's also exhausting, and we need allies. And I think that willing to be vulnerable in front of students, and which is not really recommended in medicine. It's a very hierarchical space. I think is what we really need to embrace. And then as we infiltrate positions of power, I think that then we can bring things that are of importance to us to the forefront. But ironically, as we've discussed with regards to couching issues of disparities and discussions of cost and discussions of patient satisfaction, unfortunately, we have to be strategic until that point in terms of engaging people on topics that they care about until we can be without the dog whistles and be honest about what's really going on in terms of disparities.
I would say this, though, it's about to piggyback on the progress point. So, I started at Duke in 1996, and so when I started at med school at Duke, there had never been any person other than a white man who had been in any leadership position, at all, in the entire history of the institution that you could see. You go around, that's all you would see. So you think about what's happened in the last 20 years. We have, you have the two women deans, you've had several chairs of different departments for women, minority, the African Americans have had different departments. The chancellor, Bruce Chancellor was Asian, the parent was African American. So I think those are really visible, powerful sort of changes. I know it can be tempting to think about how things aren't where we would like them to be, or will never get better. And I know that. But I think about some of the things that actually occurred 20 years ago. There were professors who were openly supporting or openly talking about their love of the Confederacy. That was actually literally happening in front of other black students. People were literally talking about that sort of thing. These are things. There's so many examples that I could go on and on and on about. So I think that I would have to push back to say that there's been no progress at all. I would have to push back some. I know that it's certainly a lot of things that are continuing to be discouraging, but I would say that as an institution, you look at this as one example, there has been some progress. As far as moving forward, I think having representation is important, because one of the challenges, if you're the only one, and that still continues to be a problem. I think the medical school has actually done a better job than the faculty and then the clinical departments in terms of faculty, in terms of retaining minority faculty. And that's been a problem because if you're one of the only ones, it can be really exhausting, and there can be this always constant role of you being the one to represent Damon, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Which can be really exhausting. So I think the medical school has actually done further. I think this course that you've been involved with also, I think students were involved in that being a course as well, is also, again, a sign of progress. Sometimes out of things that happen that aren't good, that sometimes good things can come from that as well. So that's sort of my more optimistic look at that larger piece.
Her course is involved in the culture of the diversity and health disparities. It's great.
Yeah. Just one last thing I wanted to say was I agree with you. I think that the course of progress in America and racial progress in America is a relapsing, remitting situation. Exactly. And to quote Bill Clinton, who is a special man, but nonetheless has a way with lines. There's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed with what's right in America. And I really believe that. You know, I watch the very, very entrenched social immobility within the United Kingdom, where my husband's from, and the extent to which it's been much harder for ethnic minorities there to break into places like Oxford and Cambridge, where he had one black woman in his Oxford class, in his Oxford college. At the same time, they have now outstripped us with regards to social mobility, with regards to income inequality. So that is disturbing to me, that a place that still literally has landed, titled people who do nothing, and it's considered a good thing if you don't have to work for your money, that they have more social mobility than we do. That's crazy. So again, I hope that we are making an ever, albeit sometimes relapsing approach to progress. But I think we have to take a real look at inequality right now as well.
On that note, I think our time is up. I know there are a couple other questions, but Thomas is telling me we've got to stop. Sorry about that, but you can catch our panelists afterwards, all right? Thank you all so much. And thank you.